Welcome to the Innovation, Business, and Law Center program. This is the final one of our fall speaker series on art and the law. I'm so delighted to see all of you here and everyone who's on Zoom as well. I'm Jason Rantanen. I'm the Hammer Boyd Professor of Law here at the Law School and also the Director of the Iowa Innovation, Business, and Law Center. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, one of the main things that the IBL Center does is it does a speaker series every semester that revolves around some kind of theme. This semester, our theme is art and the law. Next semester, our spring semester, our focus is going to be on name, image, and likeness, sports, and the law. So I'm really excited about that one as well, but I'm even more excited about today's program. Today's speakers come to us from the University of Iowa Stanley Museum of Art. First, I'd like to welcome Lauren Lessing, the director of the University of Iowa Stanley Museum of Art. Now, Dr. Lessing received her PhD in the history of art from Indiana University in Bloomington. She became the director of the Stanley in July 2018 after many years of experience working in art museums, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, and the Colby Museum of Art in Waterville, Maine, where she built the education department and created innovative educational programs. Her parents, both artists, were students of the Stanley Museum's first director, Ulfart Wilkie. Did I pronounce that right? All right, Ulfart Wilkie. And she's loved the University of Iowa since she first visited here. And next, I'd like to introduce Cory Gundlach, the Stanley's Curator of African Art. Now, Dr. Gundlach holds a PhD in African art history from the University of Iowa. And before joining the Stanley Museum in 2012, Dr. Gundlach worked at the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery in Fort Collins, Colorado, and at the Morris Graves Museum of Art in Eureka, California. As part of Homecoming, the inaugural installation at the Stanley Museum of Art, he curated 4 exhibitions of African masks, cloth, and textiles, and other works from the Sonder and Stanley collections. His curatorial works received support from the University of Iowa International Programs, Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, and the Interdisciplinary Project for the Advanced Study of Art and Life in Africa. Today, our speakers are going to talk for about 40 minutes or so about research into provenance and authenticity, copyright and privacy, and repatriation. After our speakers talk for about 40 minutes or so, there'll be some time for questions.
Thank you very much for hosting me and Lauren today. It's a pleasure to be here. So in today's presentation, I'll share with you a case study that involves some objects from the African collection at the Stanley Museum of Art that are specific to issues of authenticity and provenance. In November of 2020, the Stanley Museum of Art hired its first curatorial assistant for provenance research. Funded in part through the Mary Hagihara Kajowski Memorial Fund, dedicated to the former director at the Stanley Museum of Art, this temporary position was offered to Mason Cohn, who's joining us today, a current student in the College of Law. I would like to use this opportunity to express my gratitude again to Cohn for the phenomenal work he did, and I look forward to exploring similar partnerships with other students and volunteers interested in provenance research at the museum. Lauren and I also look forward to discussing some of the fruits of his labor toward the end of our presentation today. Like many historical African art collections in museums around the world, provenance information for most African objects in Iowa begins with a chain of ownership outside the continent. For example, while we don't have any documented information about where, when, or by whom a coda-style figure in the Stanley collection of African art was made, it was, according to Christopher D. Roy, formerly part of the George Gershwin collection. Quote, "It was said to have stood on the piano of his New York apartment," Roy wrote, quote, "and the bass was made to match the color of his piano," end quote. As one of America's greatest early 20th century composers and jazz musicians, how could Gershwin's taste in art be anything less than superb? The question surely crossed Max Stanley's mind when he purchased the object from Gaston de Havilland in 1982. And whatever primary source documentation was missing from the provenance could surely be found through research on similar objects. This research on the Stanley collection of African art would be directed primarily by Roy, the University of Iowa's first faculty member in African art history, appointed in 1978, the same year that Max and Betty Stanley agreed to donate their collection of African art to the university. As an art collector, Max Stanley was primarily interested in artistic quality. He introduced Roy to Mark Felix, a Belgian art dealer who sold his first object, this Yaka-style figure, to the Stanleys in 1979. Beginning in 1980, Roy and Felix began hosting university courses on connoisseurship and authenticity in African art at the Stanleys' home in Muscatine, Iowa. And in 1982, Max formalized a rating system for his art collection with 5 categories: AAA, AA, A, and D. He ranked his Coda-style figure as AAA, outstanding. Items in this category should be masterpieces of the finest museum quality and equal to superior pieces in the best private collections. Judgment should be based upon their sculptural and aesthetic quality without regard to tribal origin or materials. And he rated the Yaka-style figure as AA, excellent. Items in this category should be the quality found in important museums and the better private collections. Judgment should be based upon excellence of sculpture or uniqueness, or a combination of these characteristics without regard to tribal origin or materials. Nearly every object purchased from Felix received the same rating and was accompanied by a certificate of authenticity, such as the one you see here, accompanied by this Bembe or Nyundu style mask. This mask was purchased by Betty Stanley in 1988 from Mark Felix. Throughout his career in Iowa as a faculty member in art history and as a curator for the University Art Museum, Roy also served as a collection advisor to the Stanleys and in several cases sold objects to them as well. As a world-renowned scholar of art from Burkina Faso, he contributed significantly to the subject through publications, exhibitions, and nearly 40 years of field research in West Africa. He acquired 3 Bois-style masks here on the left, and 1 Bobo-style mask on the right from Burkina Faso for the Stanley collection, and advised the Stanleys regularly on other purchases. A Mosi-style crest mask on loan to the museum from the Roy collection is one of the few historical African objects in Iowa that included African provenance. And here you see an image of that mask on a shrine in Yako, Burkina Faso. According to Roy, this mask had become useless as an altarpiece for the owner, Rasablaga Banguku of Yako, Burkina Faso, who sold it to Roy so that he could commission a newer and more effective example for his shrine. Besides working with Felix, Roy also advised the Stanleys on purchases from other dealers, such as Michael Oliver, who sold a Guro-style mask from Cote d'Ivoire to the Stanleys in 1983. There's 2 images of this mask here. Painted in red, black, and white, it combines the features of an antelope, crocodile, and or a dog, and is commonly referred to as Zamble, or, quote, he who has eaten his master. Competing Zamble masks appear at funerals and as a tribute to the deceased. And given the worn surface on the extremities of this mask in Iowa, it would appear that this mask has been performed many times. As a sacred mask representing a nature spirit, it would ordinarily receive sacrificial offerings from the owner, and this might explain the patina, which appears slightly encrusted along the crevices. In 2008, Eberhard Fischer, a German ethnographer and former director of the Rietberg Museum in Zurich, Switzerland, published Guro masks, performances, and master carvers from Ivory Coast. In a section on commercial Guro sculptors, he provides a short biography of Beli Bita, here on the right, and pictured sculpting a mask here, who lived from 1949 to about 1990, also known as Descar, and who Fischer calls, quote, the master of elegant forgeries, end quote. As the manager of his own family workshop, pictured here with a couple of his brothers, Descar was a 3rd-generation sculptor who nevertheless claimed to be entirely self-taught and capable of carving in every mask style known in Cote d'Ivoire. In his biography of Descar, Fischer publishes this object as a, quote, faked Zamble mask, carved and aged by Beli Bita, end quote. Not only is the mask identical to the one in the Stanley collection, but the illustration is identical to an archival photograph located in the museum's object file. Here. Shown here on the far left. Interestingly, Fisher omits the proper credit line for his illustration. Whoops. Here in the middle. And instead inserts his own name in parentheses, dated 1984. Fast forward to 2017, when my wife and I strolled through artifacts here in Iowa City. It was there that I found this beautiful Yaure-style mask, which I acquired for the museum that year. It comes from the estate of the late Margaret Ruth Alexander, who lived from 1950 to 2006, who studied art history at Columbia University and graduated from the Pennsylvania Law School in 1980. And just before her death in 2006, was appointed as the United States Agency for International Development Director of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The mask at Artifacts immediately caught my attention, and the style seemed strangely familiar. Through consultation with Fisher and Zurich, he confirmed that the attribution belonged to Descartes himself. And noting that the black patina, white and blue coloration, and oversized bite stick, sticking out here on the left, are, quote, clear indications for work by Descartes and his circle. And you can see the nearly identical style for the mask he's carving in this photograph with a bird on top. The mask in our collection features a hairpick above the head. Sorry, I lost my place. Okay. So when I asked him about the other mask, here on the left, he writes that, quote, to the Zamble mask in the Stanley collection, I am 100% sure that this is a fake. Not an ordinary fake, but a highly sophisticated one, produced by the great master carver Beli Bita, called Descartes. When I met this artist in his home in 1984, only a few years before his death, I had taken the photograph of the Iowa Zamble, amongst others, for discussions in the field of rural carvers, and it was Monsieur Descartes who spontaneously jumped upon the Iowa picture and declared it as his own work triumphantly, end quote. In an invoice from the dealer sent to Max Stanley in 1983, he writes that the Zamble mask is, quote, the oldest and finest example of a Zamble antelope which I've ever owned, and consider it among the absolute top rank of all those which I have seen in public and private hands, end quote. Indeed, Max himself ranked it as a AAA in his own collection. An undated document signed in the upper right by Chris Roy notes that, quote, possible history of the Stanley mask. After I showed the photo to Ibrahima Kone, chef antiquaire de Zouanoula, Côte d'Ivoire, I bought this mask with great difficulty 2 or 3 years ago in Côte d'Ivoire from the village elders and sold it to Samir Boro. If it has a crack in the back between the horns and is repaired with an iron plate, which you see here, close up of this section here, and here's a photograph looking down on top of the mask, which shows the crack. If it has a crack on the back between the horns and is repaired with an iron plate, this is the mask I sold. The document continues. Is it a very old mask? Oui, oui, il a dansé trop même. Or yes, yes, it's been danced even too much. And here you can see an iron plate or bar and the cracks between the horns. Reattributed to Beli Bita, both masks now appear together in fragments of the canon, African art from the Stanley and Saunders collections, an installation that's part of the inaugural exhibition at the Stanley Museum of Art. Paired objects from both collections invite us to compare variations of artistic quality and the extent to which material evidence, such as physical wear and patina, are able to serve as indicators of authenticity. While Max Stanley's rating system and meticulously documented correspondence with dealers and art advisors makes it clear what he valued in African art and why, such detailed information is absent from the Saunders archive. Fragments of the canon invites us to explore why African art was important to Dr. Meredith Saunders, who lived from 1930 to 2016, as a Black man born, raised, and educated in Iowa in the 20th century, and who gave portions of his African collection, such as these extraordinary Bobo-style masks, to the Stanley Museum through a series of gifts in 1986, 1995, and posthumously through his estate in 2017. Like most of the objects in the Stanley collection, nothing in the Saunders collection has documented African provenance, but many of the objects in the Saunders collection, such as these masks, are entirely consistent with the artistic quality of AAA rated objects in the Stanley collection mentioned above. There are also objects in the Saunders collection, such as this Mosi-style Karanwemba mask, labeled as a quote-unquote tourist copy in the object file, that are stylistically consistent with quote-unquote D-rated objects in the Stanley collection, such as these Guro-style masks labeled as quote-unquote airport art by Max himself in 1979, and by Christopher Roy in the following year as, quote, quite new but well-carved masks which were apparently produced by a skilled traditional artist who adhered to traditional Guro canons of style. These objects will be especially valuable to me in teaching, end quote. So why was the Saunders collection excluded from teaching African art history at Iowa? Without Saunders' perspective as a collector of African art, how relevant and how meaningful is the canon of African art in Iowa today? And finally, what role, if any, does provenance play in this context? While meeting up with my curatorial colleagues from LA and DC and Dakar this summer, we discussed the merits and pitfalls of making provenance plain on the labels we use to display and identify African objects in collections and exhibitions. I lamented the fact that such information is rarely, if ever, included on object labels, and that in order to support social justice in the museum, priority should be given to the public presentation and transparency of this information. My colleague in DC disagrees. Including the names of European and American art collectors and dealers on object labels in our exhibitions, she argued, merely glorifies the names of collectors and dealers we commonly find in auction records. Real provenance research, she claimed, takes shape through a written historical context and collaborative programs that address the issues head-on. Representation is one of these issues, and with respect to the African collection in Iowa and collections that have become standard, canonical resources for teaching in Iowa, I offer fragments of the canon as an example of this work. The Saunders collection is on exhibit because pedagogical standards of artistic quality and historical significance in African art are mere fragments without representation from the only collection of African art at the Stanley Museum of Art assembled by a Black American. Thank you.
So I'm going to completely shift gears briefly, and then we're coming back to African art. But I wanted to talk about some of the other legal issues that we have dealt with and are dealing with as we prepare to open Homecoming. And now that we are in our new building and the exhibition is open, you know, how do we interact with the legal world through the operations of the museum? And I have to give a shout out to Gabe Pelzer, who's in the Office of Counsel here at the University of Iowa, who has been just an invaluable resource to us as we have, you know, pursued our work as museum professionals with an open museum. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, and these both topics will touch on issues that other speakers in this series have discussed. The first topic is copyright and fair use. So just to review, you know, works are under copyright for generally 70 years after the death of the maker. So for an artist like Grant Wood, whose famous painting in our collection, Plaid Sweater, you see in one of our banners. These banners are out on Madison Street in front of the museum. This work, he died very young. And so we've already crossed the threshold for this item to be in fair use, or to be in the public domain, except that Grant Wood's sister, Nan Wood, applied to renew the copyright on his works, which is something that you could do before 1985. And so that extended the copyright for all of his paintings 95 years after the work was created. And so this is an artwork that was painted in 1931. So we have to wait until 2026 before this image, we own the painting, but the image will not be in the public domain until 2026. The copyright, like anything, any other property, copyright can be sold, inherited, or donated. The copyright for Grant Wood's entire body of work is held by the Figge Art Museum, our partner art museum in the Quad Cities. So when we reproduce this work on a public sign outside the museum, we should have to apply to the Figge Art Museum for permission to reproduce this artwork because they hold the copyright, except that it might be covered under fair use. And fair use stipulates that, it's complicated. It's codified in Section 107 of the Copyright Act. It provides that fair use of a work for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, and teaching, including multiple copies for classroom use, scholarship, or research, is not an infringement of copyright. And then to determine whether a given use is fair use, you can consider the following 4 factors. The purpose and character of the use, including whether the use is of a commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes. We don't charge admission to the art museum. Everything we do is nonprofit and for educational purposes. The nature of the copyrighted work, is it more factual, like a news photograph, or creative, say a landscape painting? All right, they have us there. This is a creative work. The amount and sustainability of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. Is it just a portion of the artwork, or are we reproducing the whole thing? So this is a slice of plaid sweater right down the middle, not the whole work. And then finally, the effect of the use upon the potential market value for or value of the copyrighted work. By displaying this banner, have we reduced the value of other reproductions of this work? So after reading through these 4 factors, I felt strongly that our work that this use of our painting was protected by fair use. However, our head of marketing and communications disagreed. She thought, if we reproduce this, we're going to hear from an organization like the Artists' Rights Society that protects these are big organizations that are looking for reproductions of artists' work, and they will call you and tell you exactly what you owe them if you don't apply for copyright in advance. So this is a case study I want you to think about, because at the end of our, I'm going to talk and then turn back to Cory, and then we'll have time for questions and answers after both of us are done speaking. So hold this in your mind, because I want to hear what you all think, if this is fair use or not. Okay. Another legal issue that we've dealt with recently. You can go to the next slide. Oh, it's right there. It's in front of me. Sorry. This is not the Stanley Museum of Art, but I did choose an art museum that has a very similar collection. I think this is the Whitney Museum of American Art. So, access and privacy, in particular service animals and their use in the museum. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed into federal law in 1990, protects people with disabilities' physical access to public spaces, including museums. And for many people, physical access is dependent on a service animal that can help them with one or more of the following things. Mobility assistance, such as pulling, bracing, stabilizing, or guiding. Retrieval, fetching items that have been dropped, bringing items to the person, or going to get help if needed. Indication, this would be alerting a deaf handler to sounds, or a handler with low vision to someone standing near them or a barrier. And finally, medical alert. There are service animals who can sense an oncoming seizure, for instance, or low blood sugar. So only service animals are protected by ADA, but there is no licensing agency that determines what is a service animal or how a service animal is trained. So this has opened a giant loophole. Some people have animals that, they genuinely depend on, but that were never trained as service animals. And others simply take advantage of this law to bring their pets with them wherever they go. So how can art museums regulate animals in their galleries for the safety of audience members and their collections, ensuring the access of all people to museums and complying with ADA, which we very much want to do, but also protecting the collection from animals that might never have been trained to behave in art museums? According to the American Alliance of Museums, you can legally ask only 2 questions. The first question is the animal needed to help with a disability? The answer to this question should be yes. Service dogs should assist medically disabled people. And the second question, what tasks is the animal trained to perform? So it's up to the service dog's handler how much detail they give, because this touches on their private medical history, which is protected, legally protected information. So staff cannot ask what a person's disability is, because that would be rude and intrusive as well as illegal. Nor can we ask for a demonstration of the task that a dog is trained to perform. So my question to you is, how do we manage animals in the museum? And we have seen a lot of animals. Most of them have been clearly service animals who are performing really invaluable services to make public spaces accessible for their handlers. And a few of them have been, terriers and purses. So, hold that in your mind too. And then again, when we're in the question and answer session, I'm interested to hear what you think. All right, I'm turning it back to Cory.
The next thing I'd like to address is how the Stanley Museum of Art has engaged with issues of restitution and repatriation. And I won't be sharing any images. This is a conversational topic specific to the use and the reproduction of images about objects from the Benin Kingdom, which are arguably the highest profile objects surrounding this issue in the media. And thank you again, Mason, for all your phenomenal work on provenance research. When he first took that position in November of 2020, we have 6 objects at the museum that are associated with the Benin Kingdom, 4 of which are made of metal, 2 of which are carved from wood. And so those were the priority items for Mason to conduct provenance research on. And in the early stages of planning for our inaugural installation, I made it a goal to uphold the frankly conventional values of institutional transparency that most museums embrace. And throughout my research on the art of the Benin Kingdom and the violence and trauma surrounding their expropriation during the siege of 1897, it became clear to me that the educational value of these objects was incommensurate with their value as symbols of loss and trauma and violence to those that they actually belong to. And so what I showed you previously in terms of the fragments of the canon exhibition, that is now the space that I had originally devoted to these objects from the Benin Kingdom in our collection. So I won't be sharing images of them with you because we frankly do not have permission from Oba Eware II, who is the king of Benin in Benin City, Nigeria, to use them in an educational capacity. And there is no consensus on this point. Some of my colleagues among Big Ten universities continue to use these objects in exhibitions, publications, and websites to teach people without permission from the owner. And it's my personal opinion that no one other than the Oba himself has the right to make that determination. It's important to recognize that there are 3 specific conflicting claims on these objects among the Oba himself and among representatives of a group formerly known as the Legacy Restoration Trust, and also Governor Obaseki, who's working with cultural officials around the world on a new museum. Last summer, I believe it was June or July, the Oba of the Benin Kingdom came out and publicly denounced anyone and everyone working on behalf of the Legacy Restoration Trust seeking to claim the ownership and ownership of these objects. So it's been very confusing for a lot of people. But that was a very definitive moment when the OBA came out and spoke plainly about this. And so through my work at the museum, I've reached out to an artist that is a member of the royal family. Her name's Peju Layuola, and we are lucky enough to have her work in the inaugural installation. There's a large quilt in an installation called History is Always Now, and the title of the quilt is Ohe Market Day. So Peju Layuola is granddaughter to the Oba, and she was technically born in the palace. Although it was an accident when her mother was visiting the Oba, her mother went into labor and she was born in the palace. So she has that claim to fame. So in working on provenance research and building on the fine work that Mason did, I reached out to Peju as an artist and as a scholar of contemporary art from Nigeria, and as a member of the royal family as an appropriate consultant on how to move ahead with these issues. She introduced me to Prince Agatis Eradiawa, who is the brother of the Oba. And so I'm now currently in direct communication with a representative of the court of Benin. And I've received an invitation to attend a festival, an Igwe festival this December, which is basically a public manifestation of the power and historical significance of the Benin Kingdom. So it's an incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create a partnership with one of the world's greatest kingdoms, and whose royal treasury has been expropriated and disseminated around the world, and within the last few years returned. In many cases, the National Smithsonian Museum of African Art recently returned objects. Many objects from Germany have been returned. An object from Jesus College has been returned. So we're in the moment of returns. They talk about, critical turning of events. So this is the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, in terms of repatriation and restitution, because the documentation surrounding the expropriation of these objects from the Royal Palace in 1897 is so exhaustive. It's impossible to deny that they were stolen and that they don't belong anywhere without the Oba's permission. There are counter-arguments to this that claim that these objects belong within the diaspora so that global Africa has access to them wherever it may be. And I think that's absolutely fine as long as you get permission from the Oba. And I think people usually fail to remember that these do belong to him as the king, and that without his permission, it remains stolen property. So Lauren and I are in direct communication with Agatis to make sure these objects are returned properly to their rightful owner. And in that process, build one of the most meaningful relationships that this museum can make. So again, this is the low-hanging fruit. And so everything else, the sort of gray area surrounding objects without documented African provenance, those are the really tricky objects. And so beginning with objects from Benin, where you can trace owner to owner all the way up to those people that were directly buying from commercial agents and soldiers involved in the siege of 1897, it makes it look easy, even though it's very time intensive. That level of detail just doesn't exist for the vast majority of objects in collections of historical African art in museums around the world. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of partnerships to be made with representatives from the continent, not only those in the Kingdom of Benin, but others as well. And so I'm thrilled to be a part of this, and again, thankful for Mason's help, and I'm happy to answer questions about this topic.
All right, Cory, you have referred to the siege of 1897. Perhaps everybody else in this room knows what that is, but maybe you could give us a little historical background on that.
Sure. So this has to do with the colonial history of interaction between modern day Nigeria and the British commercial and military agents that were involved in occupying this area of West Africa. And by that point, the British were quickly establishing a protectorate within the region, with specific interest in oil resources. And so basically, they arrived at a time when the Oba was conducting a very important ceremony. And there was a British official that showed up and demanded to seek an audience with the Oba. And the Oba sent one of his representatives and told these British officials that it wasn't a good time to meet. And the British, being as arrogant as they were, pressed on. And there was a conflict, and there was a loss of life, a relatively minor loss of life, I think less than 5. The British retaliated with massive force and killed at least hundreds of people and destroyed everything in their way, including the palace, which burned to the ground. And depending on who you talk to, some say it was an accident. The plaques that you see on display or used to see on display among many museums, there are probably somewhere between 2 and 4 or maybe 5,000 of these plaques. Those were discovered beneath the palace. And the idea is that they were probably quickly removed and hidden because they knew of the impending attack by the British, and so they were trying to store them and protect them. But after the palace burned to the ground, all of these objects were collected and brought back and sold off to basically fill the coffers of both the private colonial commercial agents and some of the soldiers involved in the attack. There's been several books written about this. I think one of the most well-known is probably Dan Hicks' Brutish Museums. And in fact, his book provides some of the most comprehensive primary documentation in terms of the photographs of just the military siege and the violence that took place during that attack. And, it involved the sending the Oba into exile, into Calabar, and the kingship, was basically out of commission for, I want to say, at least a generation. And it's also important to know that the Queen Mother, the title of Queen Mother Iyoba, has only been in office twice since the siege of 1897. And I'm working with another contemporary artist in Nigeria that makes art about that. So that siege was the central event surrounding the expropriation of this huge treasury of what we refer to commonly as the Benin bronzes, but in fact also included things like wooden boxes, carved wooden hens that would have been placed on a Queen Mother's shrine, such as the example we have here in Iowa, enormous ivory elephant tusks carved with narratives of activities within the royal court. All of these objects are basically narrative scenes of life in the court over the last 5 centuries. And that's what you see in museums and in private collections today. So the siege of 1897 historically has been referred to as the punitive expedition, which Dan Hicks and others rightly recharacterize because it assumes that there's some sort of punishment that these people deserved. It was an outright massacre. It was a siege, and so we call it a siege today. Yeah.
All right, so I have a question from online. What impact does repatriation of items or refusal to take such actions have on the estimated value of a museum's collection? How is it insured and its reputation?
That's a good one. I could take that one if you want.
Go for it, yeah.
So I think, when we think about the reputation of a museum, particularly a museum on a university campus, it's very, very important that we adhere to ethical standards of good practice. So, I think of university art museums as leaders. We're in a position to do things that our larger neighbors, often, better funded neighbors, and big art museums like the Art Institute of Chicago or the Metropolitan Museum of Art, things that are difficult for them to do because they have ponderous bureaucracies, and they just don't have as much flexibility. I think also our affiliation with universities holds us to a very high standard. We're here to teach about aesthetics, about construction, about innovation, about materials, about history, but also about the right way to be a human being in the world. And that entails not knowingly displaying and keeping work that's been looted. So I have to say I have a personal connection to this because members of my family were dispossessed during the Holocaust in Europe. And at the end of the war, which they survived miraculously, there were, I have one relative, the wife of my husband's uncle, who came back to the house where she had grown up and could see that the furniture and all of her, material, everything that the family owned was in the house, including her father's prayer shawl, which was being used as a tablecloth. And the people who were standing in the doorway said, "Nope, we've never heard of you." So we don't want to do that, right? Like, that's not who we are. We're the University of Iowa. And I think, the University of Iowa has been a leader for over a century in the field of arts education. The very first MFAs in the world were offered here. The idea that you could talk about history, philosophy, ethics, and ideas in front of actual works of art and have that as a benefit that you offer to your students, that idea started here. So we want to be leaders here. We don't want to be recalcitrant in doing the right thing. So I hope that answers the question.
I have a question about repatriation. I know that there was at least one article in the New York Times about reproductions, and that the technology has gotten so great, it's easier to reproduce these masters. And I was wondering, in the context of repatriation, if that's something that the museum would be comfortable doing, which is negotiating for and then using technology to have a reproduction and placing a reproduction in the museum instead of the art that's repatriated.
Absolutely, as long as the OVA approves of it, with the OVA in particular. There's a very interesting case at the National Museum of Natural History. There was a curator there that worked with indigenous nations of the Pacific Northwest to create a replica of a killer whale crest mask that was reproduced with 3D technology and put on display, and the original was returned to the clan elder with their permission. So I think that's a really exciting partnership opportunity, done with respect and done with ethical sensitivity. I think it's a really interesting. And there's a point of accessibility where the material value of that object. If the replica that took place at the National Museum of Natural History was visually indistinguishable from the original. And that level of technical precision, I think I'm totally supportive of that in the context of museum education.
Yes. I don't really know the details, and others here know it better, but it just strikes me that sitting in the Boyd Law Building, we should mention that we should invoke Sandy Boyd, who, after he was president of the University of Iowa, became the president of the Field Museum in Chicago, and was a pioneer, really a pioneer, in making explicit the ownership by the museum of Aboriginal and Native American materials and establishing partnerships with the tribal peoples to work out complex rearrangements, which became, as far as I know, models for other museums. And so we think of Sandy as a superb law professor, as a brilliant and innovative, and if you don't know, go figure it out, university president for his time. I mean, he was a pioneer in a lot of ways that we still benefit from, but we don't always, because we weren't here, it was happening in Chicago, but as president of the field, he did a lot of this pioneering work.
Thank you, Linda, for that. And of course, Native American, Indigenous American collections, museums holdings of those are governed by federal law, the the Native American Graves and Repatriations Act of, I think, 1997. And so, we are NAGPRA compliant museums. We have corresponded with all of the communities whose work we had or have in our collection, and that is work that we continue to do and that museums have been doing for the last 25 years.
I have another, go ahead, go ahead.
So is there a requirement if you return some of these objects that the owner then has a responsibility to care for them and to maintain them or to show them, or is there any reciprocity?
In the case of the objects from Benin, there is a beautiful new museum that's being built to house all of the objects that, I believe that the objects are going there. But in general, I think that it's a really interesting question to throw back to this group of attorneys and future attorneys and people interested in the law. Like, is that something that we should consider? Or when it comes to personal property, if somebody broke into my house and stole my, I don't know, what would it be? I don't know.
Parents paint
That what?
your parents'
Yeah,
pieces of art.
right, sure. And then they said, you know what? I'm really concerned that you're not regulating for humidity, so I'm just gonna keep these. The law would have something to say about that, right? And so I think, like, just in terms of consistency, it's not really, a stolen object. Even if it was stolen in 1897, and even though it passed through the hands of people unwittingly, who never intended to deal in stolen objects, most of these things were bought in good faith by people who had no idea, and that's what happens with art that's stolen often. It gets passed through chains of ownership and people don't know that work is stolen, but it's still stolen. And so I would say that it isn't our business what happens to that work. We have to give it back to the person who is the legal owner.
Thanks for leaving. I will also mention that in the Dutch principles of restitution and restoration, there's a provision that actually strongly encourages the claimant to care for and store and display the object in question in a specific way. And I find that to be highly paternalistic, and I don't endorse or condone that sort of agreement at all.
I feel like the Benin bronzes or the Benin items are such an interesting case because there is current representation that's not necessarily the government of Benin that can make claim to these items. But I'm wondering, there's probably many cases where that isn't the case, and so how do the contacts of representation, especially when the boundary lines or the government may have shifted and changed in these areas, how does that play into repatriation processes?
Well, if any of you read the recent article by David from The Atlantic, it talks about shifts of power in the government in Nigeria. It talks about the Legacy Restoration Trust. It talks about the OVA and how agendas change with each appointed official, and all the groundwork done by one is just entirely erased by the other. So how do you navigate it? I think my answer to that question is it's really, from my experience, it seems to be up to the individual institution because we don't have something like NAGPRA to provide that universal framework for engagement. So, there are museums that are working with third-party representatives outside the royal court, and the OVA has something to say about that. And it's important to recognize that this kingdom preceded the country of Nigeria, and I think that a lot of the people that are working with these third parties are much more concerned about about how these objects will be handled after the return than actually who they belong to. And so we find a lot of museums working with this third party that is more specifically interested in this new museum rather than the ethics involved. Good question.
I have another online question, and since I think this is more of a policy question than a law one, which is if the public domain is a Western construct, in the case of abandoned objects, does the requirement to get permission for the use of the image from the OBA remain in perpetuity? You talked about, for example, the reproduction, using technology reproduction. Does that essentially last forever?
That's a great question.
I mean, so saying, getting permission from the OBA for one production and extending that claim to the subsequent OBA. I think it would be up to each OBA. What do you think?
I mean, it's interesting because I think that the listener, the watcher that posed that question is thinking about the Grant Wood reproduction right and copyright expiring. And then the fact that these objects, which have sacred importance to the Royal Court of Benin, you know, they have no such copyright expiration date. I think it's a cultural difference. And it also has to do with really, you know, it's interesting because they do have sacred importance to the Court of Benin and to the culture from which they came. That I think has been overlooked and ignored. So, you know, in returning the objects, we hope to return authority over them. So I have to defer to you about that, Cory.
Sure, I mean, can you repeat the question again? Right.
I think the question is about kind of the like you were saying, right? The conjunction of these two beliefs about the law, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about the Grant Wood, right? The copyright in the Grant Wood expires at some point. The idea is everyone's allowed to use it, right? They can make their copies of it if they want because it's in the public domain now. The question is with these works, right, that you're repatriating, does the copyright
Ever expire.
does it ever
Yeah.
expire, not legally, but like as a policy matter or as a kind of moral matter, and what your perspective is on that? I think that's what the question is asking.
Yeah, that's a
Would
really
the Elgin marbles be an example of
That would be a great example of something
Yes.
Because
like
they
that.
were, the justification for the Brits holding them was always that the Greeks couldn't be trusted to take good care.
Yeah.
And they're still
Yeah.
in the British
Right.
Museum.
And they've been widely reproduced. Widely reproduced. Yeah. I think as a matter of courtesy, just speaking for myself as director and recognizing that the Stanley Museum of Art will be around far longer than I will be, you know, so policies can always change. But I think for me as a director, I would probably always defer to the OBA before I reproduced those objects because, you know, two of them we held for a number of years, and we're hoping to make that right, and because, you know, it would be an acknowledgement of the ownership of those objects by a family that was robbed of them. And so I would I would feel very uncomfortable reproducing them without permission. But I'll be interested to see if, you know, ideas about that shift in the next, I don't know, I'm 53, in the next 30 years. And then after that, I don't know.
Yeah, I would always defer to you.
Well, the attempt to enter the room means that our time is up.